The story of Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most improbable journeys in human history. It begins not in the grand palaces of Paris, but on the rugged Mediterranean island of Corsica. Born in 1769 to a family of modest nobility, young Napoleon was an outsider from the start. When he was sent to military school in mainland France, he was teased for his thick accent and his provincial roots. But it was here, amidst the isolation, that his extraordinary mind began to sharpen. He buried himself in books, studying the great conquerors of antiquity like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He was a master of mathematics and geography, skills that would later allow him to visualize battlefields with a clarity that no other general could match. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, it tore the old world apart. But for Napoleon, it was the ultimate opportunity. In a system previously dominated by birthright, the revolution opened the door for talent. Napoleon first made his mark at the siege of Toulon, where his brilliant use of artillery forced the British fleet to retreat. By the age of 24, he was a brigadier general. His subsequent campaign in Italy was nothing short of miraculous. Leading a ragged, starving army, he defeated the superior forces of Austria through pure speed and psychological warfare. He didn't just win battles, he won the hearts of his soldiers, who affectionately called him the Little Corporal. By 1799, France was exhausted by political corruption and internal strife. Napoleon seized the moment, staged a coup, and became first consul. While his military victories are what we remember, his civil achievements during this time were equally profound. He created the Bank of France, modernized the education system, and established the Napoleonic Code. This legal system replaced a chaotic mess of feudal laws with a clear, unified code that emphasized equality before the law and property rights. To this day, the legal systems of over 40 nations are based on the foundations Napoleon laid during these years of peace. In 1804, in a move that shocked the world, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. This was the peak of his glory. For the next decade, he moved across Europe like a force of nature. From the sun-drenched plains of Austerlitz to the brutal cold of Poland, he dismantled the coalitions of Europe's old monarchs. He redrew the map of the continent, creating new nations and toppling ancient dynasties. He married Marie-Louise of Austria to secure a royal bloodline and dreamt of a unified Europe under French leadership. At its height, his empire stretched from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Russia, and his name was whispered with a mix of awe and terror in every capital of the world. But the higher the rise, the more devastating the fall. Napoleon's downfall was rooted in his own refusal to accept limits. His continental system, an attempt to blockade Great Britain, led him into a disastrous conflict in Spain and eventually the fatal invasion of Russia in 1812. The sight of the Grande Armée, 500,000 strong, retreating through the Russian snow remains one of history's most tragic images. He was eventually defeated by a massive coalition of European powers and exiled to the island of Elba. Yet, in one last burst of defiance, he escaped, returned to France, and reclaimed his throne for a final 100 days. The end finally came at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Defeated by the Duke of Wellington and the Prussians, Napoleon was sent to the remote, wind-swept island of Saint Helena. There, in the middle of the Atlantic, the man who had once ruled Europe lived out his final years in a small house guarded by the British. He died in 1821, but his legend only grew after his death. Napoleon was a man of immense contradictions, a champion of the law who ruled as a dictator, and a seeker of peace who spent his life at war. His biography is more than just a list of dates. It is a testament to the power of human ambition and the enduring glory of a man who dared to change the world forever. As Napoleon transitioned from a revolutionary general to the Emperor of the French, his life became a grand spectacle that blurred the lines between reality and myth. To understand the glory of France, one must look at the years between 1804 and 1812, a period where Paris became the capital of the world. Napoleon was no longer just a soldier. He was a statesman, a lawmaker, and a patron of the arts. He understood that to rule a continent, he needed more than just cannons. He needed a cultural legacy. He commissioned grand monuments like the Arc de Triomphe, intended to be a permanent reminder of the Grande Armée's invincibility. His court was a blend of old-world elegance and new-world meritocracy, where men from humble backgrounds were raised to the rank of marshals and princes based solely on their bravery and brilliance on the battlefield. Central to this era was his personal life, specifically his relationship with Joséphine de Beauharnais. Their romance was passionate, volatile, and deeply influential. Joséphine was his anchor during the early Italian campaigns, but as emperor, Napoleon's obsession with legacy took precedence over his heart. Because she could not provide him with an heir, he made the agonizing decision to divorce her in 1809. His subsequent marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria was a cold political calculation designed to link his upstart dynasty with the ancient Habsburg bloodline of Europe. When his son, the King of Rome, was born, Napoleon believed his empire was finally secure. He saw himself as the founder of a new European order, a Carolingian successor who would unify the continent under a single set of laws, a single currency, and a single vision of progress. However, the administrative weight of such an empire was staggering. Napoleon worked 18 hours a day, dictating thousands of letters that governed everything from the price of bread in Paris to the movement of troops in Poland. His continental system was his grand strategy to defeat Great Britain by cutting off its trade, but it became his greatest administrative nightmare. To enforce the blockade, he had to control every port in Europe, leading him into the treacherous terrain of the Iberian Peninsula. The war in Spain and Portugal became a bleeding ulcer, a brutal conflict where the French army faced a new kind of enemy, the guerrilla fighter. For the first time, the glory of France was being tarnished by a war that had no clear front line and no easy victory. The turning point that turned glory into tragedy was the 1812 invasion of Russia. Napoleon's Grande Armée of over 600,000 men was a multinational force, the largest ever assembled in Western history. But the vastness of Russia and the scorched earth tactics of Tsar Alexander I turned the campaign into a nightmare. As Moscow burned, Napoleon realized that his luck had finally run out. The Great Retreat was a scene of horror that broke the backbone of his military power. Thousands died of cold, hunger, and typhus, leaving the emperor to return to Paris almost alone. The glory was fading, and the monarchs of Europe, sensing his weakness, formed the Sixth Coalition to finally bring him down. Even in defeat, Napoleon's spirit was unbreakable. After his first exile to Elba, his Flight of the Eagle, the march back to Paris without firing a single shot, remains one of the most romanticized chapters in history. Soldiers sent to kill him instead knelt at his feet. But the finality of Waterloo in 1815 changed everything. His second exile to the remote island of Saint Helena was designed by the British to be a living tomb. On this lonely rock in the South Atlantic, the man who had redrawn the map of the world spent his final years gardening, reading, and dictating his memoirs. He was obsessed with how history would judge him, carefully crafting the Napoleonic legend to ensure that even in death he would remain the centerpiece of French identity. When he died in 1821, he left behind a world that was forever changed. His remains were eventually returned to France in 1840 and placed under the golden dome of Les Invalides, where he rests today as a symbol of national pride. Napoleon Bonaparte was not just a man. He was an era, a whirlwind of ambition that took France to the heights of glory and left an indelible mark on the soul of humanity. The final chapter of Napoleon Bonaparte's life is perhaps the most human and haunting of all. After the thunder of the cannons at Waterloo had fallen silent, the man who had commanded millions found himself a prisoner of his greatest rival, Great Britain. The decision to exile him to Saint Helena, a jagged volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, was a calculated move by the European powers to ensure he would never return. This was a man who had escaped one island already. They were determined that this time, the ocean itself would be his cage. For 6 years, Napoleon lived in Longwood House, a damp and windswept residence that stood in stark contrast to the gilded halls of Versailles or the Tuileries. In this isolation, the psychological battle began. Napoleon was no longer fighting with cavalry and infantry. He was fighting for his place in history. He spent his days in a meticulous routine, dictating his memoirs to his small circle of loyal followers. He was acutely aware that while his body was trapped, his ideas could still travel across the sea. He framed his life not as that of a conqueror, but as a soldier of liberty who had been forced into war by the old monarchs of Europe. He spoke of a United States of Europe and a common legal system, painting himself as a visionary whose only crime was wanting to modernize a stagnant continent. Even in his physical decline, his mind remained a sharp instrument of propaganda, crafting the Napoleonic myth that would eventually allow his nephew to rise to power decades later. The conditions of his exile were a source of constant friction. Napoleon refused to be addressed as General Bonaparte, insisting on his title of Emperor, while his British captors were equally determined to diminish him. His health began to fail rapidly in 1820. He suffered from chronic abdominal pain, nausea, and weakness. On May 5, 1821, as a fierce storm battered the island, the man who had shaken the world took his final breath. His last words were reportedly, "France, Army, Head of the Army, Joséphine." While the official cause of death was stomach cancer, the mystery of his passing sparked decades of conspiracy theories, with many believing he was slowly poisoned with arsenic by those who still feared his shadow. But the death of the man was only the beginning of the legend. In 1840, in a grand gesture of national reconciliation, his remains were brought back to France in a ceremony known as the Retour des Cendres, or the Return of the Ashes. Hundreds of thousands of French citizens lined the streets of Paris in the freezing cold to catch a glimpse of the funeral carriage. He was laid to rest under the magnificent golden dome of Les Invalides, encased in 6 concentric coffins made of iron, mahogany, and red quartzite. Even in death, he was treated with the grandeur of a Roman Caesar. This homecoming solidified Napoleon not just as a historical figure, but as the very soul of France, a symbol of the country's highest peaks and its most tragic depths. The true glory of Napoleon, however, is not found in his tomb, but in the world we inhabit today. His influence is invisible, yet everywhere. Every time a person stands before a court of law in a country using civil law, they are experiencing the legacy of the Napoleonic Code. Every time a student enters a centralized public school system, or a professional is promoted based on merit rather than family name, they are living in a world Napoleon helped build. He introduced the metric system, centralized the banking system, and even changed the way we drive. He was a catalyst that accelerated the arrival of the modern age. Was he a hero? To the millions who died in his wars, the answer was a resounding no. But to the millions who were freed from the shackles of feudalism, he was a savior. He remains history's ultimate paradox, a man who used total war to bring about a dream of peace, and a dictator who gave the world the tools for democracy. To study Napoleon is to study the limits of human potential and the intoxicating, dangerous nature of absolute power. He was the man of destiny, a figure so large that he could not be contained by an island, an ocean, or even time itself. The glory of France remains forever tied to the name of Bonaparte, a name that continues to provoke, inspire, and haunt the world 2 centuries later. To take this series to Part 5, we must move beyond the man and the myth into the global echoes, how Napoleon's influence reached far beyond Europe, sparking revolutions in the Americas, changing the Middle East, and even influencing the art, science, and psychology of the modern world. Here is your continuous 4,000-character TTS script for the final, expansive chapter. Napoleon Bonaparte, The Glory of France, Part 5, The Global Echo and the Modern Mind. While we often think of Napoleon as a European conqueror, his shadow reached far across the oceans, touching corners of the globe he never personally visited. The true scale of his glory and his destruction is found in the global chain reaction he set in motion. When Napoleon's armies invaded Spain and Portugal, he didn't just destabilize European monarchies. He inadvertently set the Americas on fire. With the Spanish crown paralyzed by the French occupation, the colonies in South and Central America saw their moment. Revolutionary leaders like Simón Bolívar were deeply inspired by the Napoleonic legend and the ideals of the French Revolution. Without the Napoleonic Wars, the map of modern Latin America might look entirely different today. Napoleon was the unintentional midwife of a dozen new nations, proving that when he shook the foundations of Europe, the vibrations were felt 10,000 miles away. In North America, Napoleon's influence was just as transformative, though it happened at a negotiation table rather than a battlefield. Facing a desperate need for funds to finance his wars against Great Britain, Napoleon made the world-altering decision to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States. In a single stroke of a pen, he doubled the size of the young American Republic, clearing the way for it to become a continental superpower. He famously remarked that this sale would give England a maritime rival that would sooner or later humble her pride. This was Napoleon's strategic mind at work. Even when losing territory, he was playing a long game of global chess, ensuring that his influence would shape the balance of power for centuries to come. But Napoleon's legacy wasn't just measured in land. It was measured in knowledge. His invasion of Egypt in 1798 was a military failure, but a scientific triumph. He took with him a commission of sciences and arts, consisting of over 150 scholars, engineers, and scientists. It was during this campaign that the Rosetta Stone was discovered, providing the key to unlocking the lost language of ancient Egypt. This birthed the modern science of Egyptology and began a global fascination with the ancient world that persists to this day. Napoleon's desire to document and categorize everything, from the flora of the Nile to the ruins of the pharaohs, reflected the Enlightenment ideal that knowledge was a form of power. He didn't just want to rule the present, he wanted to own the past. Domestically, Napoleon's glory manifested in the physical transformation of France and the creation of the modern state. He was the first to realize that a nation's strength lay in its infrastructure and its bureaucracy. He built a vast network of roads and canals that tied the country together. But he also built the invisible structures of the modern world. He created the first modern police force, the first centralized bank, and a meritocratic civil service that became the blueprint for governments worldwide. Even the way we name our streets and number our houses often traces back to his obsession with order and efficiency. He took a country that was a chaotic mess of medieval customs and turned it into a streamlined, logical machine. Perhaps his most subtle legacy, however, is in the human psyche. Napoleon was the first modern man, the individual who creates himself through sheer force of will. Before him, your destiny was decided by your father's name. After him, the world believed that a career open to talent was possible. He became the ultimate archetype for the ambitious individual, inspiring everyone from Nietzsche to Dostoevsky. The Napoleonic complex, or the great man theory, are terms we still use to describe the drive for power and the belief that one person can bend history to their whim. He proved that the world is not static, that empires can be built in a decade, and that a single life, if lived with enough intensity, can change the trajectory of the human race. As we look at the glory of France today, we see it in the Louvre, in the legal codes of 40 nations, and in the very concept of the modern nation-state. Napoleon was a man who lived at the speed of light, burning through his life to leave a trail of fire that still glows 200 years later. He was a conqueror, a tyrant, a reformer, and a visionary. But above all, he was a reminder that history is not just a series of random events. It is shaped by the dreams, the ego, and the courage of those who refuse to accept the world as it is. The story of Napoleon is the story of us, of our capacity for greatness and our tragic tendency toward self-destruction. In the end, his glory was not just the glory of France, but the glory of human potential, laid bare for the world to witness forever. The death of Napoleon Bonaparte on the distant island of Saint Helena was not the end of his story. It was the birth of a secular religion. While the monarchs of Europe breathed a sigh of relief in 1821, believing they had finally buried the revolution on horseback, they had actually created a martyr. In the decades following his death, a Napoleonic cult began to sweep across France and Europe. Veterans of the Grande Armée, now old men, told stories of the Little Corporal to their grandchildren, painting a picture of a golden age where France was the center of the universe. This nostalgia was a powerful political weapon. It transformed a defeated emperor into a symbol of national pride and lost greatness, proving that a legend is often more dangerous than a man. This legend eventually paved the way for the rise of his nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Using nothing but the magic of his uncle's name, he was elected president and later declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. This Second Empire was a direct attempt to recapture the glory of France that his uncle had established. It showed the world that the Napoleonic brand was the most powerful political force in modern history. The Second Empire modernized Paris, giving us the wide boulevards and iconic architecture we see today, all built on the Napoleonic ideal of grandeur and order. Even though the Second Empire eventually fell, it proved that Napoleon's blueprint for a strongman democracy, a leader who speaks directly to the people while maintaining absolute control, was a model that would be imitated by leaders across the globe for the next 2 centuries. Beyond politics, Napoleon's ghost haunts the very way we think about leadership and organization. He was the pioneer of total war, where an entire nation's resources, its economy, its science, and its people are mobilized for a single cause. This concept laid the groundwork for the massive conflicts of the 20th century, but it also birthed the modern idea of strategy. Before Napoleon, war was often a series of disconnected skirmishes. After Napoleon, it became a high-level game of logistics and long-term planning. Today, business schools and corporate boardrooms still study his campaigns, not for the bayonet charges, but for the way he managed information, motivated his staff, and made split-second decisions under extreme pressure. He was the first modern CEO, managing a company of millions across a continental market. Even in the realm of science and culture, the glory of France remains etched in Napoleon's vision. He was the one who popularized the metric system, a logical and universal way of measuring the world that replaced the thousands of confusing local systems. This was a direct extension of his belief that the world should be governed by reason, not by tradition. He established the Legion of Honor, an award that is still the highest decoration in France, based on the revolutionary idea that any citizen, regardless of their birth, could achieve the highest status through service to the state. He fundamentally changed the relationship between the individual and the government. You were no longer a subject of a king, you were a citizen of a nation. The final irony of Napoleon's life is that his greatest enemies, the British, the Prussians, and the Russians, ended up adopting his methods to defeat him. They realized that to beat a Napoleonic army, they had to become more like a Napoleonic state. They modernized their bureaucracies, improved their schools, and professionalized their militaries. In trying to destroy him, they inadvertently spread his ideas. Today, when we look at the map of Europe, we see the echoes of his Confederation of the Rhine and his dreams of a unified legal space. The European Union itself can be seen as a peaceful fulfillment of Napoleon's violent dream, a continent without borders, governed by a common set of principles. As we conclude this journey through the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, we realize that he was more than just a man who wore a bicorn hat and tucked his hand into his waistcoat. He was a catalyst, a human explosion that accelerated history. He took the ideals of the French Revolution and, through fire and blood, forged them into the structures of the modern world. He was a tyrant who taught us about freedom, a conqueror who taught us about nationalism, and a dreamer whose vision was too big for the world to hold. 200 years later, we are still living in the world he made. The glory of France, the laws of Europe, and the very concept of the modern individual all lead back to that lonely boy from Corsica who decided that he was not just a part of history, but the master of it.